In a new age world filled with delusions and wish fulfillment by morons in need of attention, renowned experiencers of high strangeness and podcasters Jeffrey Ritzman and Jeremy Vaeni received invitations to a tropical paradise getaway called Paratopia. Little did they know, it was the same type of new age spiritual retreat they've been avoiding all their lives.
Oh, don't be shy.
The government doesn't care about aliens. Just ask Rwanda.
Come on, you can shake it.
Yeah. If you want real healthcare reform, vote with your Nielsen box. Watch more House.
Anything goes at Paratopia. And welcome.
Hey Paratopia, Jeff Ritzman here. Just wanted to give a bit of a disclaimer before tonight's show with George Hansen. If you'll remember, George Hansen was on our show before discussing the trickster in the paranormal. That's been some months ago now. And you can find that episode on our homepage. If you go back maybe one or two pages, you may find that interview. I encourage you to check it out if you haven't listened before to George Hansen. The disclaimer for tonight is that in hour one, most of the questions you hear Jeremy and I ask were sent to us by Mr. Hansen himself. Typically, Jeremy and I don't do that sort of thing on Paratopia. We're, as you know, a lot more freeform than that. But George felt that in order to get a cohesive view out of his findings on the paranormal in general, that he needed something with a little bit more productivity. In other words, he is going to walk you guys through the discussion tonight, which is marginality, anti-structure, and the paranormal. George has some very, very exacting and, as far as I'm concerned, mind-blowing information to impart to us about commonalities and what Jeremy kind of called structure in the anti-structure surrounding paranormal events. It can get rather complex. George felt it would be best if he took this from, what is the definition of these terms? How do they apply? What are the examples? So on and so forth. And I think walking you guys through it, I think he feels that you're going to get a lot more out of this than just random questions thrown at him by the two of us. So he's essentially going to walk you through in hour one. In hour two, we're going to be asking our own questions. I think a little bit in hour one, we did throw in a couple of our own, but by and large, the first hour tonight, we just want everyone to know, essentially is being structured by George to give you guys a nice walkthrough that's really going to help you get your heads around this if you might have had problems with it last time. I hope you enjoy it. I know I did. And I think that once you listen to this show, I think when you go to another message board or you meet someone in person and they tell you that they've had a paranormal experience of some sort, you might be asking them some different questions, a la George Hansen. Check it out. I've been doing it, and I'm telling you, the guy's onto something. So we'll check it all out right after this.
Listening to UPRN 105.3 New Orleans. No, you're not. Jeff, would you like to do the intro? You never do the intro.
I never do the intro?
That's right.
Oh, okay. How about we just launch right into the questions since we've already done the intro?
All right, good enough.
Mr. Hansen. How are you, sir?
Well, I'm doing fine. Looking forward to this evening's chat.
Yes, me too. Very much, because I've been looking forward to this for a couple of weeks now, actually. So, just for the sake of our audience here in this first hour, maybe you could go over some things that we're going to kind of try to lay a groundwork here that's organized and productive. So, first of all, where do the terms marginality and anti-structure come from, and what exactly do they mean?
Okay, that's a really good question. These are the two terms I'd really like to talk about at length this evening. Marginality and anti-structure come from the social sciences. Marginality is a pretty well-known term. It's used quite widely there. Refers to people who are sort of outsiders, maybe immigrants who moved to another new culture and are just starting to immigrate, people who may be poor, have little power or influence, people who are just sort of low status and largely ignored. And so those would be marginal people or marginal groups. Anti-structure isn't nearly as well-known a term, and it was introduced largely by a guy named Victor Turner in the 1960s, 1970s, and it refers to social structures and possibly even people who are sort of marginal, or maybe not, or there may be groups that are sort of outside the structure that are not completely integrated. It may refer to conditions where social structures are breaking down, statuses are becoming blurred. It's a little hard to describe succinctly. That's just its nature, and I won't try to, but I will try to give a lot of examples as we go along, because a lot of paranormal groups display this anti-structural trend. They don't stay together for very long. They don't achieve very much status. They tend to schism and the like. But I'll describe some and explain some examples as we go. So maybe I should give you some examples of how marginality can apply to paranormal groups.
That'd be great.
Well, let's take some of the major ones. Let's look at MUFON, for instance. That's probably fairly well known to your audience. I've been looking up some budget figures and for various paranormal groups, and in 2007, MUFON spent about $211,000. So that's not a huge amount of money, really, considering it is the largest and most prominent group investigating UFOs. Look at the number of TV shows on the UFO phenomena. Look at the movies, like Independence Day, which took in hundreds of millions of dollars in box office receipts. Yet little MUFON is a tiny organization. In 2005, I checked, had a membership of about 2,300 people. That's really, really small. It is a very marginal group. It's not integrated into any academic area, really. They may have advisors, but itself, it's sort of a standalone group. I've been out to its office in Fort Collins, Colorado. Maybe it's 150 square feet, maybe a couple hundred square feet at the most.
Really?
There are 3 women in it. They don't do actual research there. They just send out materials to their members, the journals, I guess, and the other materials. So I believe much of it is almost certainly in the home of Jim Carrion, the director. So clearly, this is a very small group, but there are other UFO groups, for instance, QFOS, the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, started by J. Allen Hynek. Its expenditures for 2007 were about $19,900. That's tiny. It publishes a magazine, International UFO Reporter, but given the, and it is a serious group, it certainly has its difficulties and flaws, but certainly they try to do something like scientific research. Right. Now, they do publish their magazine, but years ago, they published a journal of UFO Studies, which was actually quite good. It was very high quality, but that didn't last. So what we see is this marginal group. It was not able to maintain its professional level journal. It's sort of this anti-structure operating here. It just couldn't, the professional level work just did not survive.
Well, what about, let me ask you this, what about, on the other side of the coin, we have things like the Atlantic Paranormal, the TAPS thing. We've got the Paranormal State, both of which seem to be very rich by way of their interest in this stuff.
Okay, let's look at this in terms of marginality. First of all, neither of those groups have professional scientists involved to any real extent. When the TV crews go out there, they're not interviewing scientists who've been trained, who have specialized knowledge, specialized experience in investigating. What you've got with TAPS is you've got a group of plumbers. Mm-hmm. Now, what does this tell people? Well, it tells people, first of all, that maybe this TV show isn't taking the phenomena altogether seriously. In any other documentary, in any other type of investigation, in mainline science, they would not have plumbers. Now, I'm sure these guys are fairly bright and they're nice people, but they don't have scientific training or scientific background. Also, I'll point out in terms of marginality, the professional plumber is relatively low status, especially within academia. So it is very easy to ignore any claims that they might make. Again, this is a marginal occupation, certainly in academic terms. It's low status, and it tends to diminish any credibility that they have. Now, this is not a criticism of any of the TAPS members. This is just how the world works. So it is that is a marginal group. Now, if you move on to paranormal state, you don't have professors there with degrees who are working within the academic environment doing this kind of research. There's a graduate student there, and I'm not even sure how many of the people involved are still students at Penn State. But again, this gives a very clear message. This is not important enough to be within the university proper. It is out on the margins. So these groups really exemplify this low status, this marginal aspect of paranormal research. But there are other groups, too. You look at the Society for Scientific Exploration, which is largely a professional group, and they do publish a professional-level journal called the Journal of Scientific Exploration. Their budget for 2007, their total expenditures were about $106,000. That's still very, very small, and most of that went for printing costs and distribution and conference.
Right.
So, again, here you've got TAPS and you've got Paranormal State, which obviously have quite a lot of dollars behind them, but that's not real serious level research. But when you get the serious level research published in, say, the Journal of Scientific Exploration, it's a very, very tiny amount of money that's devoted to it in comparison to the popularization of TAPS or Paranormal State. Another place you might look at is the Rhine Research Center down in Durham. Looked at their expenditures for 2007, about $171,000. Now, again, that's a very tiny amount of money, and right now they're, I think a lot of that goes to building and maintenance. I'm not sure just what, but they're doing very, very little research compared to 20 or 30 years ago. So again, it's a very marginal level of effort. And you'll find this all across the board. The skeptics seem to do a little bit better. The CSI, that's Committee for Skeptical Inquiry, which is formerly known as SciCop, for 2007 had annual expenditures about $1.7 million. Oh. You know, a lot better than most of these paranormal groups, but still not a lot of money comparatively. Also, so you'll see these organized groups, some of which have been around for several decades. MUFON has been around for 40 years, and it's still essentially headquartered in the home of its executive, the guy who runs it. You don't have an office you go to where you meet investigators. There is no real paid staff of researchers there. Carrion, I think, worked, according to tax return, 32 hours a week and was paid $17,500 for a whole year. So, again, a tiny amount of money. Well, so this is a very marginal effort.
Well, I'm trying to figure out what does that say to you? What does that mean?
Okay, well, let's keep before we. That's kind of a broad question. Let's look at some other areas.
Well, hold on a sec. I don't think it is a broad question because the second that you introduced Independence Day, I immediately thought, well, there's Hotel Rwanda. That was an Academy nominated. I don't remember if it won awards, but it certainly was nominated for Academy Awards. Brought people's attention to the situation in Rwanda. And essentially, after that movie, people went back to not caring. So it seems like the marginality thing is just a function, all around. It doesn't seem to
No. You've still got a large number of people advocating intervention and aid for Rwanda.
Well, sure, they're advocating.
Yeah.
But there's still people. There's MUFON advocating for UFOs. I mean,
the MUFON really is not an advocacy group in the same sense, and you certainly don't have the Christian groups advocating for human rights in Africa. I mean, that's a much larger effort, and certainly you've got a lot more credibility and higher level people who do have some dollars who are paying attention to Rwanda. Give me some dollar figures on the amount of aid to Rwanda. Do you have that?
No, of course not.
I would suggest that the amount there is far larger than it would go to UFO research.
Okay. But I still think that the ratio of public outcry and demand for something versus, interest when it's, popularized in movies is always going to be a huge differential.
Oh, not true at all. That's entirely false. Say, look at shows like ER or House. Look at the medical establishment. You've got a $2 trillion budget that goes to medical care, health care in this country. The fictional portrayal of that is tiny.
Yeah, but those aren't
look
advocating
at top shows.
anything.
Top shows are another example.
But those aren't advocating anything.
Yes, they are. They're advocating better health.
ER.
They're advocating research.
No, they're popularizing. They're popularizing occupations.
Yes.
They're glamorizing occupations. That's all they're doing.
No, they are portraying them.
Yeah.
Look at but that's fiction. Well,
here's the thing.
Look at the dollar value.
Let me just say this: with ER and House and those things, like the things that get popularized on TV are generally occupations of people who give money, who make a lot of money, and give money to Hollywood and give money to independent films and stuff like that. I mean, that's always sort of been the way
You are
it
completely
goes.
missing the point. Look at the dollar value that goes to foreign aid and to relieve human suffering to Africa, and compare that to the amount of money that was taken in with Hotel Rwanda, which is larger.
Okay, I see your point.
Okay, let's look at police use of psychics. You've got TV shows like Medium that are on for several years. Now, how many police departments can you go to that will admit that they regularly use psychics? Not very many. How many of those police departments actually have people on the payroll to function as a psychic? I don't know of any.
Yeah, well,
to the best of my knowledge, it is zero.
Yeah, I know that there is a show called Psychic Investigations, I think it is, on Sunday nights on probably History Channel or something like that. And every story that comes on there, when you have the police officer talking about the psychic that he or she was dealing with, it's always kind of put in that context of, well, I kind of went behind my chief's back, or I didn't mention anything to the guys that I was going to see this woman about this case. It's always very hush-hush in the very beginning.
That's exactly my experience. I have been out on cases with police officers, with psychics, and that's exactly how it's done. It is marginal. It is kept very low profile. It's not they don't want to admit it, and I know of some cases in which a colleague of mine was out with a psychic on police investigation, came back, turned on her TV, and there was the spokesman for the police department outright denying they ever use psychics.
Yeah.
So again, this is an instance of the marginality of use of psychics officially in police departments. Same thing with corporations. I have done consulting for one major corporation, and we use psychics in our investigations, and paid fairly well. But it was done very quietly. They came to me because I could serve as an intermediary there, and the higher-ups didn't have to know it was being done. So again, it's very marginal. And people in the corporation, some of themselves were actually practicing psychics, but kept it very, very quiet. They did not want anyone to know they were using this kind of methodology. So it is a very marginal type of endeavor.
Well, George, how in the way of just say a police department, because you would probably know this, or corporate entities that use psychics or what have you, how successful are these things usually when it comes down to like a police using a psychic? Is there a tremendous success rate with that kind of thing, even if it's kept hush-hush?
It's not tremendous, but it does help. And I know in my work in business intelligence, it was very definitely helpful. We got some very definite leads that were just came out of the air from the psychic that we followed up on. Definitely helpful. So, again, but the corporations do not want to admit that they use it, and most of them will not, and those that do will do so very quietly. Again, it is very marginal.
What about religion?
Okay, well, religion is very interesting, too. Let's look at some of the major religions today. Catholicism certainly has a belief in miracles and even modern miracles, but it's very leery of them. They don't like to promote people who are alive that are actually performing these miracles. After they're dead, they may go through a process of investigation and eventual beatification and canonization. But often they are very, very leery of getting involved in looking at those things. Now, in Protestant Christianity, there's a variety of different approaches. In some of the more Calvinist religions and some of the more fundamentalists believe that miracles stopped at the time of the apostles. And anything that happened since might be very suspicious and very likely the work of the devil. Again, marginalizing the occurrence of the phenomenon. Some of the more liberal Protestant denominations, especially in the seminaries, advocate something called demythologizing, which suggests that some of the stories in the Bible and modern miracles were simply, they didn't happen as they were actually reported. A very, very skeptical, debunking type of an approach, actually. A Christian Science is a really, really interesting case, because there you would think that they believe that the mind can heal, and with the name science in the name, you would think they'd be very, very open to scientific investigation of the power of prayer. And in fact, actually the opposite is the case. People who try to verify their practices scientifically have been excommunicated, shunned, and in a very, very vicious manner. If you want to, there's a very interesting book on this by a guy named Bill Sweet, who's a friend of mine. It's titled Journey into Prayer, about two researchers who were actually very active in Christian Science and were actively trying to prove their effects scientifically. And they encountered enormous hostility by the Christian Science hierarchy. So again, it is marginalized within these religions. Modern-day witchcraft is also rather interesting. If you go back 30 to 40 years ago, there was a fair amount of interest in the efficacy of magical practices for real practical use. Mm-hmm. But today, there's much, much less emphasis. And what's happened in modern-day witchcraft is that there has been a push to become a bit more respectable and a bit more accepted, getting chaplains in the military and the like. And with this growing respectability, there has been a decline of interest and emphasis on the practical utility of magic. So again, they're pushing that off to the side. It's less important. You can see the same thing happened with the Pentecostals. In the early days of the Pentecostal movement, there were signs and wonders that were quite amazing accounts. But as the Pentecostal movement became more structured, less anti-structured, more with a bigger hierarchy, more organized churches, the emphasis on signs and wonders diminished. And some of the academics now who are writing on it, some of whom grew up in Pentecostal movement, you read their writings, they seem really embarrassed by those early accounts and tend to avoid mentioning them. The New Thought movement, for instance, also has an interest in these kinds of phenomena, actively using mental power to bring about practical effects. But those churches are quite marginal. They might use rented halls. I know one in the Princeton area doesn't have its own church, but rents a hall. And there are relatively few children that come. They're very marginal groups. So even in religion, miracles are nice maybe to talk about if they're long ago and far away. But if they're upfront and personal, they're generally not too well received. The one religion that is very open to them, of course, is spiritualism. But that's an extraordinarily marginal religion. Very few have their own church halls. They often rent. And in this country, it's really declined for the last 50 years dramatically. So again, spiritualism is the one religion that actively courts direct engagement with the phenomena, but you rarely see it. And certainly very few people will put down spiritualism as their main religion.
But George, I don't want to derail us too bad here, but I do have to ask this to kind of drive the point home about the religious aspect of this, because I'm sure that this is going to come up on the message board one way or another. How would something like the Fatima occurrence fit into the marginal area of this whole discussion? How does that fit into it being marginalized as an event? Because that was supposedly a lot of witnesses and whatnot.
I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you...
the Fatima... I guess you'd call them manifestations of some kind. I have not read a ton about them, but I have heard a lot of people bring that up as far as a religious event, which I kind of debate that it was a religious event based on what I've read about it. I'm curious how something like that, which I think is acknowledged by the church, is it not?
What event? I didn't...
Fatima.
Fatima?
Yes.
That is, but it's long ago, far away. It's not current. It occurred with relatively young people, peasants, as I recall, who were quite marginal figures to start with. People who would normally be overlooked outside the realm of usual power structure. It was temporary. It would occur. The phenomenon occurred on days predicted, but then it was transitory. It did not stick around, and people came from miles around, thousands of people, and then it evaporated. So yes, that phenomenon was acknowledged, but it is not. But it did occur in a marginal area, in a rather, I think, a setting that was rather poor.
Right.
So yeah, it did not occur in the church itself with the bishops and the priests officiating. It occurred outside the structure of the ordinary church.
And were those children, were they belittled and berated by the church at the time of those events?
I have to go back and look at that. There's several books on that. There's one by Stanley Jackie, who's a Benedictine priest, I think, at Seton Hall. But I can't speak in depth on that this evening.
Yeah. Okay.
But certainly the people who were involved were not, especially the children who were involved, were not part of the church hierarchy themselves at all.
Oh, right, exactly. Well, to move on with this, I guess the next part would be colleges and universities. I mean, how do they treat this whole paranormal thing, and is it as marginal there as it is everywhere else?
Oh, it's at least. But just think about, when you go to even grade school or junior high or high school, you don't cover these topics in any science class. And when you go to colleges or universities, they are almost never mentioned. They may be mentioned in humanities classes and literature classes, but that's it. But that sends a rather strong signal that, okay, they're fine for fiction, but the way we find out how the world works is science today, and they are not covered. I don't know, there are very few classes in this country for credit that discuss paranormal topics. Back in the 70s and 80s, there were a number, not a large number, but you could find out where fairly easily because some of the societies would publish lists. But today, there are very few indeed. There are very few researchers in universities that spend any time at all doing research. Back in between 1979 and 2007, there was the lab at Princeton University that was quite high profile within the parapsychology field. However, within Princeton itself, it was not terribly well received. It had a very small office laboratory in the basement of the engineering building, but there was no sign on the door really letting you know what it was. There was a small psi symbol on it, as I recall, but they kept a very low profile. And a number of the professors at the university were very unhappy that the lab was in existence. So again, it was a very marginalized operation, even though they could bring in a substantial amount of money, and there were benefactors who were willing to donate a considerable amount of money. The university did not want to accept it, and the laboratory eventually closed. But this happened down at Duke University as well, and there are a number of other instances like this throughout the history of psychical research.
Is there any evidence that, as they were trying, in whatever universities or colleges that were trying to study this, that in trying to study it and in trying to bring it into a scientific structure, that it didn't respond well to that?
Well, there certainly have been some very successful experiments done in universities. My own feeling, though, is that it may not be a good venue for this kind of research. Probably the best example would be the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Robert Morris held the chair of parapsychology there, and he died several years ago. And he was able to produce quite a number of graduate students. So the field was expecting that with this large number of graduate students, I think the number was on the order of 20. It might be plus or minus a bit, but it wasn't 100, it wasn't 5 or 10. But we expected a fairly large amount of research to be generated and published in the parapsychology journals. That really hasn't happened. So whether the pressures from the universities have kept it from happening or what, I'm not sure. But there are a number of his graduate students now who hold academic positions, but who have not really produced much in the way of new research. So that's a very good question. And I do suspect that the university environment may not be particularly conducive to good results. It is a very structured, a very hierarchical organization and subculture. And these phenomena tend to avoid that. Like Fatima, it did not occur in front of the bishops and the cardinals and within the church. It occurred outside. I suspect these other paranormal phenomena may have a similar characteristic. Now, certainly you can do very tightly controlled experiments with these phenomena and get some rather strikingly good results. I've been involved in some studies like that, and I have a number of colleagues who have too. But there may be something about the organization of the culture that affects this. These phenomena do seem to be very affected by human consciousness, and not just the people who are directly involved immediately, but perhaps later on as well. There is something called retroactive PK, and that's been rather reasonably well established in laboratory situations. And it does suggest that paranormal effects may be caused, at least in part, by groups of people, and before or after the event may even take place.
Huh.
Now, that's a pretty wild idea, but retroactive PK has been studied for well over 30 years. So I would not totally dismiss the idea that human consciousness may go back and forward in time and somehow subtly influence certain paranormal phenomena. Now, that's
George,
how?
Yeah, oh yeah. In the sense of like what you've done with, very rigorous setups and studies of this phenomena, whatever phenomena you may have been into at the time, in kind of a structured way. How difficult do you find that to get any sort of result from any sort of paranormal phenomena at all, being as it seems to avoid structure and routine and all of that kind of thing? I mean, doesn't that play a huge part in not getting results?
No, it depends largely on the personalities involved. I've worked with some very good people who seem to be able to facilitate production of the phenomena. People who are in the academic world, especially in Europe, seem to be highly status conscious and really kind of convey that to people, and they're not aware of themselves doing it. But the people I've worked with who've been very successful at producing psychic phenomena were not status conscious and were able to relate to a lot of different people. So again, this notion of structure involves status to a very significant degree in the anthropological theorizing. And people who are able to transcend or overcome their status levels and kind of level the field and the interaction, so people seem to be more equal, are much better at it. Whereas especially some of the British researchers I've known were extremely snobbish, and people had an immediate reaction to them. I remember seeing in our laboratory, and that puts people off. But people who are able to work with people effectively, and we had one woman I worked with who was just extraordinarily good at putting people at ease and relating to them, and she did very, very well.
Well, I guess that kind of leads us into the next question, which is, how about you give us some examples of how marginality and anti-structure could affect a person involved in the paranormal?
Okay, well, let's give some examples. One of my favorite examples is Francis of Assisi. And he was a very marginal figure in a number of ways. He was known for healings and levitation and talking with animals or communicating with animals. But he basically rejected the workaday world. His father was a rather wealthy merchant, and he started giving away some of his father's goods. Well, his father was not too happy about that and went to the bishop and complained about it. And Francis of Assisi then took off all his clothes and said, "You're no longer my father. God is my father," and basically took a vow of poverty and was no longer part of the typical everyday workaday world structure. He then relied on the generosity of others, and basically so much so that the church had a really difficult time taking care of him and his followers. So he was very much outside the structure. And he was a very marginal figure. Another set of marginal figures are spirit mediums. Many of them donate their time. In some ways, they are like psychotherapists. Often they get paid relatively little. They do it as a calling, not as a career. If they are operating, they're not operating out of any big, large corporation. They may operate out of their homes or some small spiritualist church that barely ekes by.
Right.
But some of these people are very gifted. I've met a number of them. But they are very marginal. They're not terribly welcome in corporations doing that kind of thing, and especially not in the academic world or in mainstream religion. They are marginal figures, yet they have some real talent.
What about someone like Aleister Crowley?
Well, he was certainly out on the edge.
Yeah.
Didn't
Just a little.
Yeah. A good example. Very involved with magical practices, did not follow the standard moral requirements of the day, and was very heavily involved in occult practices. And anyone today who advertises themselves as an occultist is probably not going to be working at an ordinary type job, at least one with some status and responsibility in the typical corporation today. That's an area or an endeavor that you would take on your own and probably keep pretty quiet if you were employed in a well-paying job.
Right. Does that not in some way, and I'll try not to get you pissed off at me this early.
That's okay.
Does at some point, it's been flipping through my head every time we're talking about a marginal personality in this, that by and large, wouldn't you think that a lot of that is due to the paranormal just kind of being sneered at as, crazy, or, that dude's really out there, or, they just have an overactive imagination. Something that not everyone experiences is bound to be marginalized in some way, especially if it's something as subjective as the paranormal can be at times.
Well, that's partly true, but you can look at some very highly regarded people. For instance, Brian Josephson, Nobel Prize winner in physics. Mm-hmm. And he has come under a number of attacks in the media for his interest and support of parapsychological research. Mm. So it's all around. There are people who may indeed act rather marginal and may indeed act a little bit crazy because of their beliefs and their experiences, but people who are not that way still get treated. Robert John at Princeton University was the dean of the Engineering and Applied Science School. And he also really came under considerable attack for his interest and involvement in these researches. So, yes, part of it is indeed there is a crazy aspect to this. But even if when there isn't, the taboo and the stigma still is active. Now, this is not something new. It's not something that happened just within, the last few hundred years. You can go back 1,000 years or 2,000 years, and you can see similar types of stigma and taboos.
George, I'm just wondering if this plays into, and if it does, then how, what you had said, I think it was in our last, if it wasn't in a private conversation, it was in our last public conversation, that you can actually pick out people in, for instance, ufology, who you think are going to sort of end up going off the deep end. Does this play into that at all?
Well, certainly. John Keel, in one of his, I think, the Mothman prophecies, said the phenomena seems to have a battle cry that goes like, make him look like a nut. And involvement with strongly functioning paranormal phenomena often can have very dramatic psychological repercussions, sometimes good and sometimes not so good. For instance, near-death experiences can have very profound effects on an individual. Bruce Grayson has a very interesting case, and I think of a mafia hitman who had a very profound near-death experience. and basically turned his life way around. And his girlfriend was rather pissed because he was no longer very interested in making a bunch of money. So some of the results of these phenomena can be highly positive, but some others can be very destabilizing. I've known a number of researchers who've been divorced. I've known a number of who've had other personal problems in their lives, and particularly ghost researchers. And ghost researchers are out trying to interact with the phenomena on a somewhat regular basis. And I have observed a number of them who have been quite active who've had rather difficult personal relations. And I think it strikes me as far more than the average person would. Mm-hmm. And if you look at ghost research groups, they often schism rather quickly. So yes, involvement with these phenomena can be destabilizing. They are anti-structural in that sense. They are not conducive to establishing long-term, stable relationships.
So if you can pick out the person in the crowd who's going to go bonkers, then does that not imply that it's just about personality types? There's a certain personality type that will stay afloat in this, and then there are certain personality types that won't, and that you can sort of key into that?
Well, there are certain types and certain patterns that you can see. Particularly people who have reached middle age and have achieved a certain amount of status and some distinction within their field. If they come into paranormal fields, they are particularly vulnerable to making rather silly statements and doing things and saying things that really have little or no basis rationally. You can also watch people along their careers and just see what they're saying and see how they're changing. Some people seem to be able to handle it fairly well, and others do not. And this is sort of a long-term, longitudinal observation that you have to make.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have kind of a cruel question.
Okay.
Which is that, I'm no fan of exopolitics. And in fact, I'd be hard-pressed to find a sane exo-political proponent myself. But then Richard Dolan comes along, and he seems to sort of fit the normalcy category in a certain way. But lately, he's been called into question on certain things, and I'm wondering how you see him. Do you see him as the same as the other exopoles, or do you think that he is different? Do you think he's falling into sort of the trickster trap, or do you think he'll survive?
Well, Richard's a very interesting case. He's certainly very, very bright. I think everyone would give him that. But let's look at his way he makes his living. He does not have a 9-to-5 corporate job. He is definitely out on the margins, not part of a larger structure to any extent, as far as the workaday world goes. So that gives him a certain amount of freedom. It also places him in a position of some vulnerability. If he were working, say, in a laboratory situation, say in parapsychology, he would have colleagues. If he were working with a ghost research group on a day-to-day basis, he'd have colleagues that he would interact with day in and day out. With the type of work he's doing, he would be a bit less structural, more anti-structural, and probably more vulnerable to some of the trickster types of phenomena that tend to occur. I haven't watched him closely enough, and I wouldn't want to comment on any specific things that he's done recently because I just haven't followed him closely enough. But he is a very interesting case, and certainly of the few people I know in the exopolitics, I certainly would give him much more credence than the others. Michael Salla is a very interesting case. He seems to have been reasonably well accomplished in the area of political science. But when he got into the UFO field, he wrote very interesting papers that would be in a style very much like an academic paper, but citing some of the very worst and some of the very poorest quality writing in the UFO field from researchers and sources I know to be extremely dubious, and that would be very kind. Sala showed no critical judgment whatsoever, and that's exactly the type of vulnerability one likely will encounter when one sees what someone relatively accomplished in these other fields coming into the paranormal field and thinking the same kinds of rules and same types of approaches will apply, and they don't.
You think maybe part of the problem is that we sort of hold academics on a pedestal, and just the fact that they have a degree means that they're smart, but they might not be quote unquote street smart. I mean, you take someone like I'm more familiar with Weber's writings actually. Alfred Weber. You look at his resume and it looks pretty good, and then you read his stuff or you see his speeches and you see that it's the same thing. It's like he just completely believes anything anyone tells him and adds it to the synthesis that is his evolving description of what he believes is going on.
No, that is one of the problems with the academic mind, is it often does lack street smarts. And it does not have to grapple with direct, concrete reality very often. It grapples with symbols. And symbolic manipulation is basically the trade of the academic. They write or they do numbers. So they are somewhat insulated. And when they do encounter the phenomena more directly, they're sort of lost at sea. And Weber and Sala are really good examples of that.
Do you think that would be sort of an example of structure clashing with anti-structure?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they come from a very structured environment, so they know the rules, they know what kinds of things to look for and how to organize, but they encounter this anti-structural field, and they're lost.
Yeah, I mean, I've been sort of, I just wrote an article for UFO Magazine really panning exopolitics and sort of saying that this is how structured, I guess, rigid, educated, essentially white males who have repressed their creativity get to imagine. Do you think that's fair to say? Do you think that's sort of what this is about?
Something like this, but back in 1930, Walter Franklin Prince wrote a book titled The Enchanted Boundary, in which he described how people who were fairly accomplished in other fields came into psychical research and made absolutely foolish statements over and over and over again. And he documented this from 1930 back to 1820. So this is not something new. This has been going on for hundreds of years. That when people encounter these phenomena, they lose critical judgment. And that's one of the reasons there is this stigma around these phenomena. These phenomena have side effects. And one of the side effects is a loosening of the critical judgment.
Mm-hmm. So do you think it's fair to paint this picture? We've got this giant world, this broad world, and for whatever reason, humanity narrows its view, and if any of the people with the narrow views can see something of that broader world, they immediately want to filter it into their narrow view, which completely distorts it, and that sort of describes what you're talking about.
Well, that's a description. I wouldn't find that particularly useful.
Well, I'm going to get you to say why at some point. I know you don't like that question, why, but...
Why is not a scientific question. What or how are useful scientific questions.
Yeah, but I thought science has a limit here, and that's the whole problem, isn't it?
No, you can still deal with empirical reality without addressing the why. Because if you're asking why, then you've got some type of model and framework you are already assuming essentially holds. And in these fields, we don't really have that very much.
Well, we do in terms of religion. We know, for instance, when the Catholic Church builds a church on top of a pagan site, or has holidays that mirror pagan holidays, and tries to take all of that, the plethora of gods and beliefs and narrow them into their one system, that would be an example of the type of narrowing I'm talking about.
Okay, well, that happens, but it's not really key.
Sure it is. What do you mean that's not key?
No, it's really not key to understanding what's happening here.
Okay, what's the key to understanding what's happening?
You have to, I do not advocate any grand overarching narrative, which is what you are advocating. And there is no grand overarching narrative here that will explain it. It will explain parts of it, but it is very limiting once you do that. You need to deal directly with the phenomena, its effects, how they work, when they work, where they work, and what happens. You are imposing a psychological perspective here that I don't believe is terribly useful.
So what is the key? Just observing the totality of it, and not
observing the more a larger, taking a larger perspective and more the totality, the system, when it is working, when it's not. This is very abstract, and that's why I don't like to talk about this, because you cannot effectively convey this orally in a discussion. You need to do it in writing. And until you are willing to put your ideas into writing, they're really not very valuable on these topics.
Well, this reminds me of when I looked up, I used to look up things, just keep breaking down words. And I broke down, molecule into atom into particle, blah, blah. And eventually you get to force. And the definition of force is just that it is. Mm-hmm. There is no scientific what is the creator of the force. It just sort of is what is.
Yeah, what is an electron? Yeah.
And I don't know. I guess it's a paradoxical thing. Like, part of me says, okay, that's a cop-out. It's a cop-out to not say what is creating that force. But then on the other hand, in terms of the stuff that we're talking about, right, like you're saying, to put an answer on that is to then box it and give structure to the anti-structure. And so you can't really do that.
Yeah. I like your analogy of force. You come down to some level at which you just, okay, this is what is, and this is what is observed, and you can, the psychological approach and schema is sometimes useful, but the problem is parapsychology has taken a psychological approach for well over 100 years, and it hasn't really gotten very far.
One of our listeners, Dorkbot, if you'll pardon the name, was asking what investigative tools are being underutilized in your opinion. Is there any? Are there any?
Well, that's a very broad question. I need a much more pointed and specific question here. I have no idea what's being talked about.
In Psi research.
Well, I think virtually all are being underutilized. There is very little Psi research being done compared to 20 years ago. I mean, there are very
Is there anyone doing quality Psi research today that you can point to?
Anything Ed May does, I would take very seriously. I don't know how active he is right now. Anything, I don't know if that William Broad has done anything. There are relatively few that I have much confidence in at this point. Etzel Cardania is very bright. Not doing probably the kinds of things I would do, but I would pay attention to him.
He'd also asked, and this is a broad question too, what are your thoughts on Rex and Ray Sanford?
Very interesting guys. I had quite a fair number of interactions with Rex. He certainly had visited labs I worked in, and we had a lot of interaction. Early in their lives, they had very striking UFO encounters. Rex has done some of the very best, some of the very top research in parapsychology. He's one of the very best researchers in the field. He's retired now. He's, I think, living down in Texas or thereabouts. Ray Stanford has made substantial contributions to paleontology. He's found fossils that no one knew existed. And my own guess is that was probably partly due to psychic ability. Now, Rex was the scientist in the paranormal. Ray was the psychic. So I would not. You'd have to evaluate them very differently. And I'm not nearly as familiar with Ray's work as I am with Rex's. But Rex had some very interesting experimental work and some very interesting and influential theoretical work, conformance behavior and psi-mediated instrumental response. Now, those terms will mean almost nothing to most of your listeners, but they received quite a lot of attention within the professional literature.
George, what people out there are not widely known that deserve closer attention or at least a second look, in your opinion?
Anything by James Spottis would be another person. I'd have to, that's kind of an unfair question. I'm not prepared to answer that. I'm not following that literature as closely as I once was.
Well, let's blame that on Dorkbot because he asked that question as well. So that's his fault.
No, those types of questions, if you want to give them to me ahead of time, I'd be willing to certainly look into that a little bit more.
Okay.
One time I was reading all the journals almost almost cover to cover, and I don't do that now.
The other thing that came up on our boards, which also came up on our last episode, was the Linda Core Tilly, or whatever her real last name is, case. And I've read your paper with your co-authors on that, and what's fascinating is the correlation between what she's saying and I think it was Night Eyes. Is that?
Oh yes,
the sci-fi story. Was there ever a proper rebuttal to how that's even possible? That it was so exact?
Well, I think Bud and Linda tried to respond. By the way, the last few days I have posted a couple, I think 3 more pieces from that time period of articles I produced and that were circulated. So they are now up on my website, so if you want a bit more detail. Also, Bud and Linda both published several things afterwards that appeared, like I think in the MUFON Journal and elsewhere. So there is still a fair amount of literature out there, and other people have contributed to it too. So Greg Sandow was another person who wrote. So, I haven't compiled a bibliography of all their writings, but perhaps you could get such from Bud or Linda or some of the partisans.
Mm-hmm. Well, have you personally heard anything that has been a good rebuttal to what you wrote?
No. And I don't know of them addressing anything in my book, and I had a chapter that was largely devoted to that case. Mm-hmm. I think that the case still gets some attention and is given some credence by a number of people, the older guys in ufology, but given the claims, it doesn't seem to have drawn quite as much support as Bud had hoped.
Hmm. Well, yeah, I had read, I think it was Walt Andrus Jr. who was saying, well, I've heard some of those tapes by some of the people who you're even questioning whether they exist or not.
Uh-huh.
And not only do they exist, but they don't sound like actors. I don't know. Does that do anything for you? I mean, so what?
No, that doesn't. There are lots of pieces of evidence that Bud could turn over to law enforcement authorities to help identify those people. Right. He didn't do that. In fact, Secret Service visited him and Linda, and they apparently did not provide Secret Service evidence that they could use to identify those individuals.
Hmm. Well, I don't know if Bud practices this or not, but I've certainly seen it elsewhere, where a case will be built up and everyone signs non-disclosure agreements, and the people involved, the investigators involved, really don't want to hear anything negative about the case. They sort of just boot you off the case if you say something negative, and then publish each other's results, or I should say, publish each other's quotes about the case as if sort of backing it up. But it's really all this.
Do you have a specific case in mind?
No, not well. Yes, but nothing that I can talk about publicly. But I've seen this in action, and I'm wondering. Well, it sounds like you haven't seen this in action. Have you?
I have.
Okay, so you think something like that is going on, where this was supposed to be the big gravy day for everybody? They were all going to cash in on this. You think that's possible?
No.
Huh.
No, I don't believe that Jerry Clark or Walt Andrus or David Jacobs were hoping to cash in and make a bunch of money based on this case. I just don't think they're that kind of people. I think they're basically honest people. I think they were taken in by the story. I don't think they had any ulterior motives, and I don't think Bud did either. I think Bud was basically trying to do a good job. I think he lost critical judgment. I don't think he was, maybe he expected to achieve quite a bit of acclaim, but I don't think he was primarily in it for the money, and I don't think he ever was.
And you've met Linda, correct?
Yes.
And did you think that she was honest with you when you spoke with her?
No. She admitted she lied to me.
She did?
Yes. In fact, I put that in my paper.
Yeah.
Huh. I guess I glanced over that. Very interesting. Well, see, now here's the thing, then. This just makes me want to, quit and give up, and now I can see where everyone eventually does. When I see something like that, or Greer, which is my greatest example of hearing someone speak and immediately knowing that they're, completely full of it.
Well,
if so many people don't know that, and these are the researchers, then how can you trust any of the research?
Right. No, and again, with Greer, I don't know him personally. I've had minuscule interaction with him. My guess is he's probably quite sincere.
Oh, no.
No,
you'd be wrong about that, sir.
No, he has certainly got problems with grandiosity, but that doesn't mean I don't think he's in it for the money. He certainly could be much better off if he were pursuing medicine.
George, you do realize that he sent out emails from his website asking for people's stimulus checks, right?
Oh yes, I've gotten those.
Yeah.
Perhaps now he has gone over and I know he likes to fly first class, likes to be treated real well, and ask people to send him the frequent flyer miles or whatever.
Right.
But basically, I think he is caught up with the idea that this is really the most important thing in the world, and we can do it. And he may have started believing this very, very deeply, and maybe always did. I think Greer is a smart guy, and I think if he actually were in it for the money primarily, he would be in some other field, because he must realize very few people in these fields make a lot of money. Mm-hmm. I think the driving force with him, and this is purely speculative, I think it's a genuine desire to have an impact by making public all this information about UFOs, which I don't think this will happen. I don't think the UFO phenomenon is anything like what he believes it is.
Have you ever seen him speak publicly?
Yeah.
Huh. Well, I've seen him speak once publicly, and I just immediately thought, okay, pathological liar. And that sort of answers it to me.
Well, I've encountered so many people who I knew were talking bogus, but when I talked to them and got to know them, came away with I could see why most people thought they were lying. And I had good friends. I had a colleague I worked with who I didn't catch him, but he was being taken in over and over and over again. In fact, I've had several colleagues like this, and who would just absolutely admit this was true paranormal phenomena when obviously they were magic tricks. Mm-hmm. And none of these people were making any substantial amount of money, and they were giving their own. One was living in a very impoverished existence, trying to prove that these phenomena were real, and his colleagues were all laughing at him. Yet he persisted, and he died begging for money, literally. So I have some sympathy for those people, but they've lost the critical judgment. Mm-hmm. I don't think they're con artists, and I know people have said that about Bud, and I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't think Bud's
he's
a
very.
No.
With Greer, I don't know nearly as well, but if he were smart and operating, trying to make money, he would realize there's not that much in these fields.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess I have sort of one final question, and then Jeff, whatever you got left, go for it.
Sure.
Which is that Jacques Vallée has said he basically left because there's nothing left to learn. Do you think that there is nothing left to learn?
Oh, I think there's plenty left to learn, but you need the appropriate theoretical perspectives and knowing how to ask the right questions. And right now, most people in these fields are locked into paradigms and mindsets that don't allow them to ask new and different kinds of questions. That's the problem. You need younger people with a different approach. And I think there are lots of things to learn, but the standard scientific paradigms that we use, chemistry, physics, biology, psychiatry, medicine, and the like, don't really apply very well here. Even most of the perspectives in the humanities. But I believe that there are some perspectives from the social sciences and the humanities that could be very valuable. The whole notion of deconstruction has not been effectively applied to the paranormal. Colin Bennett has just begun that, and I think there are a few others. But these are drastically different ways of thinking, and strong deconstructionist ideas meet with extreme resistance in the science amongst especially old white man scientists and others. And it's not as fashionable as it was 10 or 15 years ago, but some of those ideas are very, very intriguing. Mm-hmm. But as one gets closer to these types of phenomena and encounters ideas that tend to grapple with them effectively, they generally, those ideas become marginalized within the academic world and the scientific world. If you look at structural anthropology, for instance, there are some very interesting ideas there. But there are a number of paranormal researchers who denounced that, and they don't want to go there. So, yes, I think there is a lot to learn yet, and I think there are ways of doing it. But it is likely to be relegated to the margins. These are not going to attract mainstream attention. And once one is able and willing to understand that and accept it, then I think progress can be made. But if one is coveting scientific status, and that is really what they are trying to achieve, then they are going to have real problems. And I think that's one of the problems with Greer. He really wants mainstream scientific attention and status given to the areas of his interest, and he doesn't understand that that is not going to happen for some very deep reasons. Wow. Same with Bud Hopkins, too. They definitely want Hopkins went out and got John Mack involved, who was the head of the psychiatry department at Harvard Medical School. Brought a lot of status, but Mack himself lost considerable critical judgment when he came into these fields. He did not distinguish himself. A lot of people look up to him because of his status within psychiatry, but if you look at the quality of his work, it was not very impressive.
Well, wasn't he also involved in something that I guess would have been considered marginal before, which was something, I don't know if it was past life stuff or something like that?
No, he was involved with psychoanalysis, which, within psychology has a very mixed background and a lot of opposition, but to my knowledge, he had no involvement at all with anything paranormal before he got. In fact, I think he said he was essentially an atheist before he got involved with these fields.
Well, because I remember reading there was some kind of article in a mainstream paper. I'm going to have to search this out and find it. But it said that some of his colleagues at college weren't surprised that he was involved in the UFO abduction thing because he had been involved in X before, which I can't remember what it was. But
well, I know psychoanalysis was one of the things that was objected to by some of the scientists that were criticizing him. But he did get involved with psychical research after he was involved with abductions and I think the survival research stuff. Right. But to my knowledge, he was not involved with that before the abduction phenomenon.
Well, I think a case that shoots the mind for me, and Jeremy's probably going to kill me for bringing this up, with a lot of what you've talked about tonight, that seems to be the grab bag of marginality is the Billy Meyer case.
He's another very marginal figure.
Yeah.
And very trickster figure, yes. And again, one that scientists will run away from because, the fraud there is rather obvious.
Mm-hmm.
But again, it does taint the field. It does marginalize the field of ufology as that becomes more prominent and more well-known publicly. It does not enhance the credibility of the field in toto.
Do you think that it's a possibility that he ever had a significant paranormal experience, and that, and I know this is kind of going out a bit on a stretch here, but do you think it's possible that this phenomena is using him to marginalize itself, contradict itself?
Possibly. I don't know whether he's had a phenomena himself, but I do know mediums who I'm quite convinced did have some genuine phenomena around them, and who also were involved with fraudulent activity. So I don't dismiss that possibility. I've certainly seen that in mediumistic cases. So, but the whole notion of marginality is far more deep than we've alluded to here tonight. In fact, some of the most interesting theoretical work on marginality involves what's called rites of passage. And these are rituals from earlier cultures. And in fact, much of my work derives from an analysis of African religious ritual. And religious ritual has often been used to control and direct supernatural power. And the concept of marginality is very central to understanding ritual. Now, that's a real big leap, but it's those types of reasons and those types of very important connections that people do not understand. That's why I reject these psychological explanations. There is something fundamental about ritual, and the supernatural and control, and marginality is central to understanding that. Now, I can't explain that in even an hour or two this evening. That's a very elaborate, long theoretical discussion.
Right.
It's not too difficult, but it cannot be introduced easily.
Right.
But the understanding of marginality is far more than just a bunch of weird people. It is very fundamental to certain religious ritual.
Huh. George, what do you think? And I know I haven't got to speak to you one-on-one very much, so that you really know very little about me, if anything.
I did hear you speak at the Bordentown conference.
Oh, okay. Well, there you are. So I noticed that, and see, just to kind of preface this whole question for you, I dropped out of this field for probably, 3 to 4 years. Some time ago, and have only really been back into it, I guess, maybe another 3 years. But since about 1987, 88, when I kind of woke up to the effect that this was having on my life and some people around me, I began to take a very I guess ultimately became an unhealthy obsession with trying to find out the whys.
That's
Which,
unhealthy already to start with.
Absolutely. And as you said, not conducive to happy relationships or healthy relationships. Absolutely agree with you there, because my wife and I split up for 6 months during that time of that unhealthy obsession. But I have noticed this, as you pointed out, across the board with some people that my wife Lisa and I used to hang out with, say at MUFON meetings or places, other lectures that I would give in D.C. or around the area. Couples that we would meet, that we'd have dinner with afterwards, checking in on them a couple of years later, they had split up. And to a large degree, this phenomena being responsible for that unhealthy obsession.
Mm-hmm. And
how does that unhealthy obsession figure in to this? What part does that play? Is that a definite commonality, the obsessive nature of what it is?
Well, I don't know that it's the obsession itself. I think it's the phenomena directly. And the obsession is just one manifestation of the effect, because this whole marginality and anti-structure can be seen in a variety of other circumstances. Even when people do not have an obsession, you can have problems with relationships and.
Oh, sure.
In fact, there's some very interesting work done on Navajo witchcraft that alludes to that. Barry Tolkien has written a little bit on that. It's not necessarily because someone is obsessed. These phenomena have an existence of their own, and we are part of them, and they are part of us. The unhealthy obsession can be part of it, but it's not always necessarily an unhealthy obsession. It can be you can be quite functional, and other things can happen.
Right. Well, I noticed, I think I've made a concerted effort this go round to curtail my interest to a certain degree. I don't have a UFO library anymore because most of that was thrown out when I essentially came home and put this to bed for quite a number of years. And I noticed that, incidentally, a lot of things stopped happening at that point as well. Once I dropped into routine, it was done.
And I noticed I have sort of a corporate job. I have fewer things occurring. Even, I'm still very involved with this.
Right.
But it's much more of a structured lifestyle than I lived before.
Yeah.
And there is a reason Catholic priests are not allowed to marry. And it very much has to do with what we're talking about tonight.
Okay.
And same with monks and nuns.
Right.
There are these phenomena and when you are in a relationship, man-woman relationship, that is dyadic, that is a structure. And this phenomena is anti-structural.
Yes.
Where do you get that from?
Victor Turner.
Who's Victor Turner?
Victor Turner is an eminent anthropologist who wrote a book titled The Ritual Process, Structure and Anti-Structure. It came out in 1969. Huh. This is standard anthropology. It's not very well known. The work of Turner and his concepts come and go. Anthropology and the social sciences are very, very faddish. But these were in mainstream journals and mainstream academic publications.
Interesting.
Wow. Well, I can tell you that since our first show together, I started asking people who relate a paranormal instance to me, well, what were you doing? What was your life like around the time this happened? What were you doing? What were you not doing?
Yep.
And I've been blown away by it. Just blown away by it. And the more that I go back and think about my own things, it's been very much that way. I had a plethora of things happen after I was laid off from a job that I was at for 8 years. Boom, just instantaneously.
When I did telephone counseling, I would key into that immediately and start talking about what's going on in their lives, not the phenomena. And you're absolutely right. There would be job loss or breakup or whatever it was.
Sure.
And the more you ask, it just happens over and over. I got to a degree where I could almost predict, some of the things they were going to talk about, or I would ask them before they would say, and they'd be quite surprised.
Oh, yeah. I think that one of the things that's really kind of astounding me this past couple weeks, actually, one being, and I haven't even related this to Jeremy yet, so this is the first time I'm telling anybody about this. I play guitar. I have a guitar room here that I bought a new house, and since we've moved in here, on the very onset, we really didn't have very many odd things happen here, which was contrary to the small condominium building, which also figures into that that whole theory of yours with people coming and going and more change and less routine in a condominium setting. But since settling down here, we've been fine. In fact, my son very early on mentioned to me, he's like, Dad, it's really neat to live in a house where you don't see things out of the corner of your eye all the time. But I would say right about at the 6-month point, we've had voices in the house. This past weekend, Saturday night, was playing guitar in here at about 2:45 in the morning. My son had gone to bed. My wife was upstairs asleep. Or should I say my son had left the room. He said he was going upstairs to go to sleep. And I don't really know exactly how to explain this other than I was playing just like I always play, and I'm a metal guitarist, so I play loud and usually at a pretty quick pace. And out of nowhere, the back of my neck, the skin crawled up the back of my neck, across my shoulders. I felt the extreme proximity feeling of someone standing behind me. And very much my ears were perked to hear my son say, "Hey, do we have any more Pepsi?" Or, we're out of toilet paper. And I didn't hear any of those things. What I felt was someone put their hands on my shoulders. And when I turned around, expecting to see my wife saying, "It's late, it's time to go to bed, you're keeping me up," as soon as my head turned, the feeling left my shoulders, and there was no one there. But the door was wide open, which had been shut moments before. I don't think I have ever stopped playing guitar so fast, turned the light out, and went upstairs to bed in my life. This is since the 6-month mark. The only thing that I can put to a change is, dropping into the routine of a new home, which entails some alterations to the house itself. In other words, taking out some cupboards, replacing other ones. Does that figure into what does this?
The construction thing, in my experience, construction sites have weird things. In renovations, in ghost investigations, that would not surprise me. And I've been on several ghost investigations where there were renovations underway and stuff. There were other weird things that were happening then. So that could be, and you'll just have to see if there are more phenomena that occur. Fine, this could have been a one-time occurrence too.
It's not been in any way anywhere near as prevalent as when we were in the condo. They're usually very fleeting. This event this weekend was the most poignant, I could say, for me.
More so than seeing the woman?
Yes. Because and I'll tell you why. Because as I said to you, I was in the chair asleep. And when I woke up and I saw someone standing at the table, I was grogged out. So going by the whole, marginal issue here, I was coming out of a sleeping state. So could it have been a hypnagogic hallucination? Could it have been something like that? I don't think it was, but I have to couch that in saying I was asleep seconds beforehand, and then I was not. So did it look real? It looked real as real could get. It seemed to be my wife with her back to me. But yet my wife came down the stairs, and as I turned back to look at the figure standing at the end of the dining room table, it simply melted into the room. And I don't know of a better way to describe that. It didn't dissolve or mist away or fade out. It dissolved into the room. Parts of it became parts of the room. So very strange. But I would say from a stone-cold awake setting, this feels definitely to have been the strongest, at least in shock value. This was it. So, I have to say, everything that you've been talking about on this show and the past shows, I'm with you. I totally see all of these constants happening, and and again, the only question I have is why. So, and I know, going from the standpoint that you are, it's not a useful question. I mean, we have a lot more to do.
Yeah, if you to address that, I would start with looking at African religious ritual, and the techniques of the anthropologists have for understanding that. And most anthropologists don't get it at all, but there are some who do. It will give you a perspective that is very, very different.
And I guess probably my last question for you is, on past shows we've done quite a bit of looking into and asking questions about psychedelic experiments that people have undertaken, such as Rick Strassman, who wrote the Spirit Molecule, where people are experiencing things akin to aliens or non-human beings. And that has found a lot of similarities in feeling and in some experiences to the alien abduction phenomenon without psychedelic, the use of psychedelic compounds. One guy in particular, Terence Mckenna, we had his brother on the show to talk about some of the things that they experienced in South America, going into the psilocybin mushroom experiences and whatnot. Does that sort of thing, of course, if you want to talk marginality, well, they're on drugs, so there you are. That's why they're seeing what they're seeing. I think Terence Mckenna, said in one of his speeches that, what we drug people have that you paranormal people don't have is repeatability. And he says, they call you people crazy and they won't even talk to us. So I guess that all does fit into the marginal aspect of things, but
it does. But I generally see that body of work is leading to approach of psychobiological reductionism, and I just don't find that useful. I think that's basically people tend to start then explaining all these phenomena in terms of brain chemistry or neurology, and that is simply the wrong way to go.
I think
it's overwhelming today. Looking at the psychology of religion and all that literature that's coming out, it just is not where the real crux is.
So, meaning that you don't think it has anything to do with altering brain chemistry to perceive different realities that may exist around us?
That's simply operating at a level that's slightly interesting, but it does not get to any of the core issues.
Right. Okay. George?
It's a psychological and biological way to reduce the phenomena. It doesn't work.
Right. Well, again, George, you're a great guest. And I really appreciate you coming on. And,
I enjoy talking.
Whatever this. It's fascinating stuff. And I can promise you're going to be getting a call again.
Okay.
Because there's a lot more to go over, I'm sure.
Okay, and if you've got further shows, if you've got any ideas on which direction you want to go, let me know.
Why are magicians gay? I want that to be one.
That's an interesting topic. There's a lot to that. In fact, I am going to be writing a lot. In fact, I'm working on 3 papers now on magicians and this kind of stuff. So,
well, shoot, maybe we'll do the magician show. That'll be fun.
And by doing this show and us hosting it, are we all secretly marginal?
Well, Jeremy is definitely marginal. All you got to do is look at his video. I mean, that's slacker culture meets UFO abductions.
Plus, I'm unemployed right now, so I completely fit.
Yeah, you do.
9 to 5 for this guy.
My.
Yeah, I've understood this concept of marginality for quite a while, and if I'm going to understand it, I have to live this to some degree.
Wow.
You don't understand it unless you've lived it.
I'm quitting my job tomorrow.
No, I wouldn't recommend that. If you're married, not a good idea.
No, definitely not. Definitely not. Alrighty.
Very good. Well, thank you again, sir.
You betcha.
And you have a good night.
Okay.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
This is Stanton Friedman, and you're listening to Paratopia.
Hey, Jeff.
Hi.
George Hansen, eh?
I'm telling you, that guy. I'm
sick of him playing favorites.
Why
is it that when you ask why, he tells you where to look for the why? Go look at African tribes. And when I ask why, that's a bad question.
He doesn't like you. I don't like you either. We're wanted men. I've got the death sentence on 12 systems. I think and this is strictly from my perspective here, I think any attempt at trying to have a conversation with George is like, I mean, going into it, you're outgunned. At least I do. I'm outgunned. No, okay. Not very much. I mean, the guy has done to get to the point where he is with this, and like I said, you people out there listening, you start listening to what George is telling you to look for, you'll find it. But this is not something where it's a question of belief. You can actually go out and try this thing out yourself and see that these consistencies are there pretty much across the board.
Would you say that I've been
yeah, well, not consistent, but you know what I'm saying.
Consistencies is what you're trying to tell us.
Consistent inconsistencies, I guess is the way to put it. All that stuff is there. So there's your structure and anti-structure. But Jeremy, watching you drink water is an adventure. I mean, to get to a point where this guy is taking a massive amount of time and effort to get there. You know what I'm saying? So you already know you're completely outgunned trying to talk about the paranormal with this guy. I mean, I think he's a treasure. That's what I think. I honestly do. I think this guy is a treasure. I really do. That's not an attempt at ass kissing because, we're all marginal. Nobody's got anything to offer anyone else. But I think he's on to something really good. And, but does it inspire me to go look for more? Not particularly. I'm not gonna lie about it. To be honest with you, with this whole thing, I guess part of the reason that I've become so relatively bored and offhanded about it is because I'm not really. Well, Jesus Christ! You look like you're doing a Lipton tea ad.
Sorry, I'm wiping my forehead with my cold glass because I'm warm. I have to shut my window for this podcast.
I mean, I don't read anything about it. I don't keep up on the current news of ufology or the paranormal or any of that stuff. So, I mean, I'd say aside from this podcast and what personal interactions I have with some people who are reporting things to me or sending me photographs, which still happens, I really kind of feel like there's nothing more for me to get here. I'm not exactly sure what there is more. George has given me that there is other things to look at, other ways to look at it that are infinitely interesting. But the problem for me is going in his direction, I don't know where I'd go to look for the why, or that kind of like where does it end? Is this just a useless endeavor to try to gain any understanding of if it defies understanding?
Well, here I'll just give you a couple of problems that I have with. Now, I mean, all the sort of stuff that you see happening, and see, that does feel good, doesn't it? All the stuff that you see happening in ufology that you just said. People, you can go out and look at this stuff. I think that's all true. But, and I didn't want to bother arguing about it because clearly he's just going to argue with me about it. What are you doing now? Rubbing your nipple with your glass. Fantastic. And now gay stalker guy on the forum is going to come after me about that. But okay. In any event, getting back to, poverty issues, when you say there's this huge discrepancy between what the public interest is and what gets funded, of course, poverty issues in Africa get millions of dollars that ufology doesn't get, but in the realm of political things and political issues,
people are dying.
Of which that is a part and ufology is not,
right.
It does not get funded very well. It's a drop in the bucket. And it's been a drop in the bucket since the beginning of time, poverty issues.
Right.
In the same way that the paranormal has been, in its own way, a drop in the bucket since the beginning of time.
Right. So, poverty would be gone.
Yeah, so to me, I mean, what he's describing is just marginality, period. And I don't see the paranormal specifically fitting its own little definition of marginality in that way, I think he's completely blocking out other things that are marginal. It's just so what to me in a way. I kind of wanted to ask that. Okay, so you just defined the term marginality. So what? And the so what is marginality plus anti-structure should mean something. The so what is then. I think what I was getting out of it was. Like I said, there's this broader reality, and if you narrowly focus, if you put on blinders to, say, form a society that is rational and therefore blocks out all the other stuff, then that other stuff still exists, and, so you interact with it, and you try to bring it over to your definition of reality, which is not as broad, and therefore incomplete, blah, blah, blah. But he's saying... That's not true. I wouldn't say that. Well, what would you say? Well, I'd say nothing. Well, great. I would. I don't think that makes me wrong. I don't think that makes him right. You know what I mean? And
right.
At the same time, there is that paradox of once you do try to put this in the box, because that then becomes a box, then it's not applicable. It's the same mistake.
Exactly.
It's a paradox. It's a paradox, Bones.
Right. Right. I mean, and this is what I'm getting at. What are we doing here?
Well, yes, and then ultimately it becomes, why are we looking at this? Now, you're looking at this because a woman rubs your shoulders, and this thing applies to you, so of course you want to look into this. It's going to look at you whether you look into it or not. I
would like to know what it was, yeah.
Why do researchers look into it? I think there are answers to these things. Why do exopoles do what exopoles do? I honestly do think it's because it's their form of having a creative outlet, I'm sure that there are some scientists and mainstream people like John Mack who get into it for their own various reasons. Maybe they think it's interesting originally, something to look at, and then as they dig deeper and deeper, they apply their own personal issues onto it or whatever, their own outlooks.
Well, why they get into it, could be as simple as being thoroughly bored with their profession.
Yeah.
That could be it. I think there's all sorts of reasons why people get into it, including having personal experiences. But let's go all the way back to Dr. Matloff, who had that, to us, and we've talked about this before, what seemed like a pretty strange, could you call it paranormal experience of hearing his name called on a bike and there was nobody there. And that, I think he said that was part of what set him off on his journey into science exploration or propulsion systems or what have you. You kind of think in the back of your head, well, there had to be more there, or I That's just...
I'm reading this book about Chinese ufology. And these Chinese UFO sightings take the same pattern as you see anywhere else in the world, and it's all the Jeff Ritzmann pattern of, look at me. I mean, that really is what it's all about. It's all about, look at me. And then when you look at it and you try to describe what it is, it sort of changes up on you. Yeah, et cetera, et cetera. And so this is an interesting roadblock that Hansen sets up for himself. It would almost be like, you could see the pattern of look at me, and you could say, okay, that exists, but then you're not allowed to ask why. You're not allowed to ask, well, does that not imply that there's an intelligence that is saying look at me? Does force in the universe not imply intelligence creating force in the universe? I mean, that's action. Things do action. Intelligence creates action. You know what I mean? Like I guess there's just something I don't get about that. If you're going to say it's not scientific to ask why, well, I guess maybe I should have asked him, then what do we use to ask why? I mean, you do use something, right? You don't just say, well, it's not scientific, therefore we don't ask it at all, because science is a box. The box that doesn't work when you try to study this stuff. You know what I mean? Like, something in there. There's a question in there somewhere. Go for it.
What?
Oh, right. Why?
Now, I think what he's talking about when he says, he doesn't say you can't ask why. You can certainly ask why. It's just that it's not a productive question yet.
Okay.
I think he is very much like a scientist who, like you asked him some questions tonight. He's like, I'm not prepared to talk about that. I don't know because I haven't kept up on this or I haven't read that yet. If you send me stuff ahead of time, I'll study up and I'll know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. That's a rarity in this for somebody to say, yeah, I'm not that familiar with it, so I'm really not going to make any statements on it. I think he's very careful about what he says. So when he says the why is not a productive question, I think it's because he believes, and I think in a large part he's right, although the body of evidence for all paranormal things, to me, seems to be very large. I think there's very ample evidence by way of experience. Throw out all the physical evidence stuff. Experiences alone, I think there's enough there in mass sightings for UFOs and multiple witness ghost sightings and visual evidence. I think there's more than enough out there to say something's going on, but it's not enough to ask, why does this happen? Or what is this? Or, I mean, there's too many variables in there. As I said before, back on the old podcast, was, ghosts. How do we know what we're seeing or what we think we're hearing in an EVP is even something that's actually there at that time? How do we know that this isn't some sort of time skip based on, personal desire or focus of intent or whatever to actually interact with something from 100 years ago? How do we know that we're not time skipping and hearing voices that were literally from the past? Mm-hmm. Doesn't mean that person's spirit exists in that place. It just means that we're in some way affecting our reality, or reality is changing and we're there to perceive it. So, all the things lining up in the correct fashion for something like that to happen. I don't think we can lay down and say, what is it? Why is it? Why is this happening? As far as our thing here with this UFO story, I mean, the only thing that I come up with is looking at what it's done to me, which is to take your average. I mean, I think I'm a pretty average guy. I would say run-of-the-mill probably for the most part. And I don't think, had this not happened to me, I don't think I would have. I honestly put a lot of the direction that my life has taken to the paranormal in general. I think that part of the reason that I do what I do professionally is because of this. that creative impulse or drive, I think, may have been born out of that. I don't know that. I kind of think that way sometimes. The whole thing for me has been to force me to recognize the greater reality that we live in, and to acknowledge it as, this is every bit as, might not be able to lay our hands on it, but it's every bit as real, quote unquote, as anything else is that we perceive. I don't think that's something I would have really even thought about. I don't think most people think about that kind of stuff. Most people are too obsessed with their daily life to worry about that. I think about that stuff all the time. So that's what it's done to me. So could I say the reason that this happens is to make people recognize a greater reality, or recognize that there's more to life than what we've been led to believe? That's my interpretation of the what, the why. Doesn't mean that that's what it is. I think George is going for, why is it there? What is it? All those questions he won't get into because he's compiling all of this data to kind of nudge him along that path of really trying to analyze, what is this? Why is it happening? Why do we perceive it? What makes it manifest? That kind of stuff. So I think going from his scientific angle, he's just being insanely careful so as not to be the guy who says, hey, by the way, we've got 2 moons. And then, when we go to the moon, there's 1. I think he's a really careful guy. So I think that's what he's doing, is just amassing he's not going straight for the heart. He's dancing all around it to try and figure out, well, what's the heart floating in? What's surrounding it? That's where I think he's coming from. So for him at this point, why is not, you can ask, but it's not productive. It's great theoretical. It's great conversation. But is it really getting you towards the answer? It's not getting you towards the answer. It's just, it's stuff for talk shows. It's not addressing anything and laying out a theorem as to what is going on. Why is this happening? That's what he's trying to get at. Conversation to him doesn't mean anything, because that's not really relevant to the study. It's another idea. Great. There's a million.
Okay. Yeah, I see that. But I would like to know what else he could be saying.
What else is not a good question to ask.
Right. Well, I mean, essentially, then you've got to say that there's a plethora of answers to why, and therefore we can't narrow it down, so why is a bad question. So, what would the plethora of answers be to why setting a narrow focus on a broader reality would create... I mean, what else is he saying besides that? You know what I mean? Like, what other option is there besides what I said I thought he was saying, which is societies, or take the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church builds their temples up on pagan sites and, native sites, and incorporates all of their dogma within the church to basically be the one and only truth.
Okay.
And so if there are these other truths floating around out there, and they're just being ignored because we've put on cultural blinders for the last 2,000 years, that's what we're talking about, right? I mean, like, what? I don't understand what the other option is that he's saying that this doesn't answer why necessarily. I mean, I guess I can't see what the other option would be.
I have no idea what you just said.
I mean, that factually happened, right? I'm saying that there's this broad world of magical stuff, paranormal shit all around us.
Yeah.
And then you've got the Western mind comes along and says, well, we're just going to, first comes along and says, well, we're going to stamp religion on it. We're going to say, all this stuff is evil. And the only good thing is this. And to sort of coax you over to our belief system, we're going to incorporate your stuff into our mythology a little bit and just call it different names.
Right.
So all that's evil, this is good. So that's one set of blinders. And then science comes along and says...
Well, blinders or control mechanism.
Control mechanism, whatever, the thing that narrows your focus. And then science comes along and says, okay, well, you know what? that's not even a narrow enough. Let all that religious stuff is nonsense. Let's just keep it strictly materialistic and rational. So our focus gets even narrower. But meanwhile, it didn't eliminate, it didn't collapse all this other stuff in reality, because the other stuff is also real. Mm-hmm. And so now we're seeing this other real stuff that we interpret as paranormal or UFOs or whatever, but it's not. It's this stuff that's always been there that we've just put on blinders to. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that's, to me, what it sounds like he is saying has happened for the last few thousand years. And that's the reason that there's marginality in this, because it's always been this evolution, or devolution, if you will, into collapsing everything down into singular theory. You know, if it's not Jesus, then it's Einstein. Whatever the singular theory
Materialism or reductionist, yeah.
Sure. So if he's not saying that that's what's happening, what is he saying that's happening? I mean, what are the other options that he's saying to make that answer to the why be irrelevant?
I don't know.
Ha!
I don't know.
Screw you, George.
No. See, I didn't necessarily get that he was saying that.
Well, that's been his point, right? Was that this has been marginalized since, even Francis of Assisi was a marginal character, and
I think he was saying it went much further back than any of that. Even that, being a subjective experience, it's always going to be marginal because it's subjective, because not everyone experiences it. So it's always going to be marginal regardless. And therefore it's going to be a subject of ridicule. Or that, and this is what I was kind of getting at, I thought I was going to piss him off right off the get-go, was because this phenomena manifests in whatever ways to marginal people, then immediately it's like, well, consider the source. It's a marginal person that it's coming from. It's an unknown person, or a run-of-the-mill guy, a working class guy. I mean, how many millionaires are abductees? Somebody asked that question a while back, and I got really pissed off about it. But I thought, you know what? They're right. There isn't. It's all us unknowns. It's all of us. That.
Well, then what do you make of Whitley Strieber? That's what I was tempted to ask him. Is like, here you've got a guy
I wanted to ask him too. Yeah.
What would make him want to give all of that up to become a marginal character?
I don't know, and I don't know that you could consider him a marginal character when he's, a couple of his books, not too awfully, what's it been, 2 or 3 years that have been made into huge movies. Mm-hmm. So I don't know that he could be called marginal for this, but I know that, well, he said before that once Communion came out, I had asked him, going out and actively searching for these things, that he believed that that's why, the more you give, the more you get thing. Remember that. Do you think that there's any relevance to that? Do you think that's true? And he said, well, that's why my experiences happened, because I was actively going out in the woods to search for this, and therefore it happened. Now, when you look at, our interview with him, he was extremely upset. He was not in a happy way that day. So, I mean, to me, it fits perfect because, he lost the cabin. He became involved with it, and then the life went down the toilet,
right, yeah.
For him. So, yeah, it fits right in line with what George is saying. Beforehand, what was it, The Howling? Or Wolfen, I'm sorry.
The Wolfen, yeah.
Wolfen was one, and that was a pretty big movie.
The Hunger was a big movie.
The Hunger, yeah. So, I mean, you had those two, but he said that he had written several novels that were failures. Mm-hmm. He was largely unsuccessul for a while. So, I don't know that you can.
Yeah, but failures in the sense that they were still published. They might have been commercial failures. But then here's a question, I guess, that you sort of have to vet out, which is, are the people who are more willing to talk about it quote unquote marginal people beforehand. I mean, if you factor in, if it's true that people at NASA are seeing UFOs and are experiencers or whatever, or Greg Matloff, I don't consider him a failure. I mean, it just might be that people who are not failures don't talk about it because they don't want to take the Strieber plunge into becoming obscure marginal figures.
Well,
marginal people have nothing to lose.
Yeah, well, it just occurred to me, and this is probably not even, well, it just occurred to me, one of the similarities between experiencers being those people who are able to visualize so well are, I think I told you the other night, I read a study someone had done where they said that experiencers were prone to hallucinate. And were, again, very creative people, artists, a lot of musicians, a lot of actors, writers, that kind of thing, all with that creative bend on them. And, you know, when I think of creative people, you're talking about that despite the fact that we create 99.9% of all the world's art, music, history, you know, culture with that kind of stuff, a lot of it, I mean, creative people, we make stuff up. You know, we create things. So I have to wonder if in that framework would George say that artists, actors, writers, all these people who create vision or create scenarios or create environments, are they marginal just by virtue of being creative people? You know, you're immediately marginalized because, you know, Jeremy's an actor. Jeremy can act he can make you believe anything. You know, would anyone ever believe?
Jeremy's not an actor.
Well, I'd say you're better than most that I've seen.
I can do improv, so that's probably actually worse.
Well, I mean, for me and I've said this to you before. I took some photographs back in 2007 that I'm going to put up on the message board and say, fuck it. But my thing is, I always think of this is I'm usually the guy that gets sent UFO pictures. What happens when I take some? You know? So I'm immediately marginalized because everybody knows what I do. You think I couldn't come up with something? Please. I could fake UFO shots in my sleep. But, you know, when I do see something real, what good's it going to do anyone to look at them? Because there's always going to be that suspicion in the back of your head that he's made them up. You see where I'm going with this? So, you know, it's that kind of thing. So marginality in that way, it's not saying that artists, musicians, and all are, you know, marginal people, but there's always going to be that underlying connotation that, you know, could they be making it up? I could be fooled because they have the skill to do it.
Well,
you know,
you're never going to get rid of that suspicion, and you're right. But as far as personally, you know, I don't care about that. For me personally, like I only care about whether or not I am hallucinating. You know what I mean? Like obviously that has nothing to do with me if I'm telling the truth. So, and I am as far as I know, and so because I'm me and all of that, I want to know if I can tell the difference between a hallucination and reality and all that. And the two times that I think I have, well, that I know I have hallucinated, I knew when it was happening that it was a hallucination. The first one I put in my book, which was like a hypnopompic or hypnagogic dream, whichever the one is where you're waking up, of my mom coming into my room, tucking me in before she goes off to work. Very realistic. But the whole time even as I was talking to her and saying goodbye and all that, I was thinking, this isn't real. This isn't real. This is a hallucination. This isn't real. Complete opposite of the abduction, which was, this is real. You know what this is. Deal with it. But the other one happened, and I think I did tell you about this last week. Oddly enough, shortly after the shrooms. Or, you know, within a week of the shrooms, anyway. You know, I'm on vacation, and I'm sleeping on the couch of this cottage. My mom has her own bedroom. My sister had 2 beds in her bedroom, but I snore too much, so I ended up getting kicked to the couch. So, while there one fine night, I hear what sounds like maybe gunshots, or another cottage door slamming. I don't know. And then I hear sirens. And I wake up and I look, I turn to the door, and I'm like, I'm getting kind of nervous. I'm like, shit, is something going on out there? What's going on? Nothing happens. It goes away. I turn back around, and in this cottage, it's all like window doors in the living room. So there's like the front door, which is wood, and then there are those sliding glass doors that comprise basically the entire wall because it looks out onto the ocean. So when I turn back around toward those windows, and I have the blinds open on them, I see there are these lush trees, and there are two sets of twin star-looking UFOs. It looks like 2 points of light next to each other. There's two sets of those, and they're flying behind a tree. And I'm getting scared. I'm like, I know what I'm looking at. This is UFOs. This is holy shit. This is happening. And then I realize, well, wait a minute. What I should be looking at is the furniture in front of me, and then beyond that, the ocean. There are no trees there. Like, I knew that as it was happening. It just took a second for it to dawn on me that I'm hallucinating this somehow. And the next day, so I shook it off and went to sleep or whatever, and then the next day when I asked, my mom and sister, God, did you hear the sirens last night? They didn't hear anything. So I don't think any of that was real. It might have been a holdover from the shrooms, in just brain chemistry or something. Maybe not. Definitely the entire week I was a little freaked out sleeping on that couch for whatever reason. I didn't expect to be freaked out by those windows, but they did sort of freak me out a little bit.
Well, let's say it was a paranormal experience. Okay, let's just say that it was a paranormal experience of some kind.
Uh-huh.
You were not in your house. You were breaking routine.
Yeah, there's all of that, but I guess my point is, if it's not a paranormal experience, then I very clearly could delineate between reality and this hallucination that I was having. Mm-hmm. So to me, the argument of, well, they're just hallucinating doesn't hold water, because in reality, when you're hallucinating, or at least I do. That's sort of my point. Having had the experience of hallucinating, I know the difference. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the same way that you know the difference between a dream and reality, But you're right. I mean, is there something, that's a whole other question. Was there something creating that? At some point, earlier in the week, I was out on the deck, just like looking up the sky, and I was on the phone, I think, with Bill Burns, and I was, there's nothing around. It's just complete darkness, and but the clouds there was like a light as if like reflecting on the clouds, like a search beam up at the clouds, and it was like darting around, whatever this, light is, and there didn't seem to be anything underneath it. Maybe it was heat lightning or something. Who knows? But I don't know. I mean, that caught my eye, and I know that I was scared, like pretty much, not like completely frightened that I slept, but in fact, the first night I slept outside on the deck.
Wow.
Just cause I wanted to hear the ocean and all that, but
right.
But for some reason, those windows really got to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, like I said, completely out of your routine, not living alone, now living with two women,
And by the way, folks, never say to your mom when she asks what you've been up to, never say, oh yeah, I did shrooms. Because that doesn't go over as well as you think. You think, like, maybe I'll have this one moment of brute honesty and answer the question, and...
That's your mom,
no,
dude.
Yeah,
no
never.
Jeremy, I raised you better. Where did I fail?
I didn't get that. I got the complete silent treatment. And to me, that's weird. That's more psychologically baffling than anything. I mean, she just didn't say a word about it and kept on going with conversation. And then I was like, and then I kept like just trying to instigate and kept bringing it up. And she would just look at me stone cold, and not say anything. I'm like, are you ignoring me? How are you ignoring this? I'm your son. Like, we're having a conversation. How is this reality right now? And she just wouldn't say anything. It was really weird. And then at some point I made a comment about, I don't remember what it was, but somebody else had done something, and I made a comment about, oh yeah, sure, you'll talk about that, but you won't talk about the mushrooms. And then she just sort of snapped and said, well, for him it wasn't a choice. It was like, so I guess that was the crime of committing choice.
Wow.
The act of free will got to her.
When did she grow up? Was she a teenager in the 60s or?
Yes.
Well, there you are.
I mean, what the hell?
How do you know Mom didn't do the shrooms?
No, she didn't. My parents were hippies, but they weren't the druggy hippies.
Oh, really? Okay.
And I asked her, eventually I got her to talk about peripheral stuff. I mean, she certainly didn't want to hear about anything I had to say, but no, she had never done anything like that. I think it always scared her or whatever.
Yeah, well, rightly so.
Yeah, she was right. Well, actually, when we started talking about it, we saw there was an international movie festival. And there was a movie, I think it was called Priva. It's an animated movie based on an Indian holy scripture of some sort. And it was really good. But the whole beginning of it was pretty much in animation exactly some of the stuff I had experienced. And I was like, Ma, if you ever want to know what shrooms are, it's that cartoon that we just saw. And my sister was like, she's like, yeah, that's exactly it.
Huh.
And then so from there we sort of started talking about it, but I don't know, completely crazy to me.
Wow. I'm trying to think back to, we have a house at the beach, and I keep thinking back to instances there of weirdness, and I can't really think of any. And it is a break from routine when we go, and there have been sightings in at the ocean in Maryland. But I, like you, just have kind of an like an uneasy feeling at times down there for no particular reason, really. I mean, you actually saw something or thought you saw something. And that just makes me think of a lot of other vacations, namely, and I'm thinking of those breaks from routine. I can think of quite a few drives out to West Virginia to visit my mother's family that I think things did happen. I can't remember very much about them. I only remember one thing, which was I was asleep in the back seat, and I woke up and I was laying there, and I seem to remember a lot of rumbling. It felt like we were going awfully fast, and I remember being a little bit concerned. And before you learn how to drive, you're not really concerned with how anyone else drives. But when you learn, that all of a sudden you're like terrified of how other people drive, or at least I was. This is the only time I can think of in my childhood where my father was driving and I was genuinely a little scared because it seemed like we were really, going back and forth a lot. And then I remember just a lot of white light coming in through the front window and my mom saying, "Oh my God." And then I don't remember anymore until we ended up in a McDonald's restaurant or something like a Hardee's or something. And I remember looking between my parents and seeing 3 girls at this table that were staring at me. That's just the only one I can remember. I don't know. Vacations are weird things sometimes. I mean, they really are. They really are. I don't know why my head went in that direction, but it's probably because I'm late and hot and itchy. For all the listeners out there, I pulled up a sumac tree or a sumac bush or whatever you call it. Them things is worse than poison ivy. I'm telling you, this has been the most miserable 2 days of my life. I shit you not. Miserable. I mean, you don't have any idea.
And I don't mean to laugh at that. But I'm just picturing this giant red rash running up your legs straight into your balls.
Well, that's almost what's happened. I say there is a God because it has stopped at my scrotum. Yeah. But I mean to tell you, the worst kind of hurt. I poured alcohol on my raw thigh the other day, and it burned like someone had thrown Kingsford charcoal lighter fluid all over it and set it ablaze. And you know what I did? I went, oh.
Wow.
That's how bad the itch is when setting your leg on fire feels better. Yeah, that's relief at that point. So anyway, that's why I was absent for a portion of the interview tonight. I had to go bathe myself in alcohol. Anyway, I enjoyed hearing George talk about this stuff, and I think he does have some valid points, and and some interesting things to talk about. Like anybody else, I don't know that I agree with everything, that he puts forth. I still to this day, I think that part of this is psychological. I think that, people ridicule things they don't understand. That's just a part of life. That's the way we're built. And we're going to ridicule things that are different or that we don't understand or that we feel are silly. There's your reason for marginalizing of the paranormal subject, because people don't take it seriously. Because the people who are involved with it, to George's credit, tend to be marginal. Mm-hmm. I found what he had to say about the Taps bunch really interesting, and it's something that it's like right in front of your face and you don't see it. I thought that was great. I'm surprised he didn't mention the one critical aspect of Paranormal State that everyone seems to notice and mention except for George.
Which is what?
The guy's a douche.
Huh.
Probably shouldn't say that.
If we ever want him on the show, we don't.
No, we don't, right. But, and I think about this other show that comes on called Ghost Adventures. And boy, if you've never watched that, now there's a treat for you folks. I say tune into that. Travel Channel Friday nights, I believe at 9 p.m. Eastern, so adjust that for your location about the United States. You will see that the lead investigator on this show is let's say he should be possibly doing a Saturday Night Live skit where they pump you up, because he's a rather muscular young fellow who consistently wears very, very tight black T-shirts to show off his manly physique. And as he's speaking to the I don't know, whatever haunted location that they go to, whoever's letting them in to stay in this place overnight, I defy anyone to watch that show and say he's not showing off his muscles while he's talking. Like, you mean over here? They were over here? It's like, the guy is really posing out, man. And it's like, you watch that show and it obviously is successful. They're in their second season now, in a prime spot on a Friday night. But you talk about marginal. Oh my God, they are marginal.
That reminds me. I can't believe, and this makes me question George. How does he think Greer is an honest soul? Really? You've seen him speak publicly, and you think that Greer believes anything that comes out of Greer's mouth?
What I got from that was that it goes back to the Seinfeld episode. It's not a lie if you believe it.
I think Greer believes it. Well, but the only excuse I can make for George on that is that maybe when he saw Greer speak, Greer was in his manly, serious phase and not in his I'm Richard Simmons selling you products phase.
Right. Yeah. Maybe.
Right? Because wasn't he that way? Wasn't he like a serious sort of speaker and all that at some point?
Yeah, he has gone through a lot of incarnations of personality over the course of time that, since I don't know, 2000 or something is when I first saw him, or 2001. That's when I first saw him talk in public. But he had been on TV I'd seen him numerous times. He was on the Larry King Live at Area 51 thing. And I think that was the first time that I saw him on a really big show that I genuinely, he was on 2020. CSETI, they did a special on UFOs, and then CSETI was part of that. And that was really that did not bode well for Stephen Greer and the group. But when he was on Larry King, I think it was the first time, and to his credit, Stan Friedman kind of took him to task over something that he said. And I'm telling you that George is right when he says he is not a stupid man. Because he could say something right to your face that is just absolute balderdash. And when you call him on it, he'll find a way. He will find a way to skip around it and come back at you with it. He'll find a way to get out of what he just said. What he said on Larry King, he was asked, how much do you think the president knows? And he said something beforehand like, well, of course, Bush Sr. knew as head of the CIA and this, that, and the other. How much the new president has, and I don't even know who the new president was back then, but whoever it was, he said, how much they've been briefed, I really can't comment on that. And Stanton leans up and goes, what does that mean? I mean, he was, put off generally by that comment. Now right away, as soon as Greer floated that out there, that could mean one of two things. I know something you don't, right, and it's big, or I don't know anything at all. And of course, his answer was, I don't have any idea how much the president's been briefed, so I really can't comment on that. That's the kind of comments that Greer floats out there.
But the way he originally said it, it sounded like
the cloak and dagger Greer that we know today.
Yeah. This is what it makes me sad is, when I did the Paracast grilling of Greer, we got taken to task for it, and someone actually wrote to me recently, or I think via my Culture Contact blog, basically the same criticism, saying, well, you couldn't take down Greer, basically saying he made you guys look bad, you couldn't even take him down, blah, blah, blah. And there was a lot of sympathy. I remember after the show, there was sympathy for him, even on the Paracast forum, which is, to me, really sad. It's like, here's a guy who, even if we all agree that he's a fraud, the fact that we couldn't catch him in something blatantly, get him to admit that he was lying, means that he somehow won a debate. You know what I mean? Like, I think that's the sort of sick, sad, intellectual style over substance thing that goes on in this country where, I mean, how is that even... I don't understand how you even think that way. You know what I mean? Like, in my head, we shouldn't even be having this discussion. We shouldn't even have to have him on the show to try to catch him at anything. It should be self-evident. Right, yeah. It shouldn't be a battlefield, Yeah, no. I mean, there are certain things, again, this all goes back to my original years ago thing that sort of set me off in getting into wars with certain people in ufology, which is claiming that there are certain things that are self-evident if you are at all smart. And I think that's one of them, and then people argue, well, whose self should it be evident to, or who's to decide that, and blah, blah, blah. And I don't know, this just raises that once again for me. Hearing about Greer, it's like, God, if this is not self-evident by now, then we're doomed.
And henceforth the reason I'm so bored of all this.
Doomed to repeat failure, yes.
Because that's all that really comes up, so often. I mean...
And then Hansen comes in and says, well, you're not doomed to repeat failure. Failure's built in. I mean, that's the whole thing. You know what I mean? And then it's like, well, okay, so what's the point? Then why are we here doing this? This circle jerk of failure.
That's my quote now forever. And there you go. There is the copy for the back of the long-awaited, much-anticipated Paratopia t-shirt.
Circle jerk of failure. And don't forget to visit George Hansen on the net at www.tricksterbook.com. That's, once again, www.tricksterbook.com. Go there, read his stuff, buy his book. Do not join the circle jerk of failure. It might be the only way to not join the circle jerk of failure.